It was supposed to be just another busy Friday at the airport. The terminal buzzed with travelers rushing to catch their flights, the smell of coffee hanging in the air as announcements echoed overhead. Among the crowd was Zoe, a 19-year-old college student with bright eyes and a backpack stuffed with textbooks. She'd been looking forward to this trip for months, a chance to visit her grandmother after a brutal finals week that had left her running on empty. Now boarding flight 372 to Atlanta, the announcement came, and Zoe joined the line, ticket clutched in her hand. She found her window seat, 14A, and settled in, tucking her backpack under the seat in front. The soft morning light filtered through the small oval window as she watched the ground crew load luggage into the plane's belly. Maybe now she could finally get some sleep. More passengers filed in, filling the cabin with chatter and the sounds of overhead bins clicking shut. Zoe had almost dozed off when someone stopped at her row. "Excuse me," said a sharp voice. Zoe opened her eyes to see an older woman with perfectly styled blonde hair standing in the aisle. The woman wore an expensive-looking cream suit and carried a designer handbag that probably cost more than Zoe's tuition for the semester. "I believe I'm in 14C," the woman said, not making eye contact with Zoe as she stored her carry-on in the overhead bin. "Hi there," Zoe smiled, trying to be friendly despite her exhaustion. The woman, who people would later learn was named Helen, didn't return the smile. Instead, she sat down stiffly, leaving the middle seat empty between them. Her perfume was strong, expensive, and overwhelming in the small space. As the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, Helen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing sideways at Zoe several times. "The standards on these flights really have gone downhill," she muttered, just loud enough for Zoe to hear. Zoe pretended not to notice, pulling out her earbuds to listen to some music. The plane took off, climbing into the clouds, and about 20 minutes into the flight, Zoe needed to use the restroom. "Excuse me," she said politely, unbuckling her seatbelt. "Could I get past to use the bathroom?" Helen sighed dramatically, as if this simple request was a terrible inconvenience. "Can't you wait until the beverage service is over?" she asked, gesturing to the flight attendants who were just starting to prepare the drink cart. "I'm sorry, but I really need to go," Zoe explained, already standing in the cramped space. With another heavy sigh, Helen unbuckled and stood up, moving into the aisle with exaggerated movements. As Zoe squeezed past, the plane hit a small patch of turbulence. "Watch it," Helen snapped as Zoe stumbled slightly. "You did that on purpose." "No, I didn't. The plane just..." Zoe started to explain, but Helen was already on a roll. "You people always think you can just push your way through life, don't you?" Helen's voice grew louder, drawing attention from nearby passengers. Her face had turned red, her carefully applied makeup crinkling around her angry eyes. "I'm sorry if I bumped you," Zoe said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It was just the turbulence." "Don't give me excuses," Helen hissed. Then, as Zoe tried to move past toward the bathroom, it happened, fast and shocking. Helen's hand came up and struck Zoe across the face with a sharp slap that echoed through the cabin. The sound cut through the ambient airplane noise like a thunderclap. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. A baby somewhere in the back started crying, as if sensing the sudden tension. Zoe stood frozen, her hand moving to her cheek, more from shock than pain. Her eyes wide with disbelief. A flight attendant at the beverage cart turned around, mouth open in surprise. For 3 long seconds, the entire plane seemed to hold its breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And then someone stood up. 3 rows back sat Thomas, a doctor with tired eyes and rumpled clothes. He'd been at a medical conference for the past 4 days, sitting through endless presentations and networking events. All he wanted was to get home to his wife and kids. He'd been half asleep when the commotion started. The sound of the slap jolted him awake. At first, he wasn't sure what he'd heard. Then he saw the young woman standing in the aisle, holding her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and hurt. Thomas had seen this kind of thing before, not on planes, but in life. Those moments when someone crosses a line and everyone freezes, unsure what to do. He'd always told his 2 teenage daughters that when you see something wrong happening, you have a choice: look away or stand up. Without even realizing he was moving, Thomas unbuckled his seatbelt. The middle-aged businessman next to him glanced up from his laptop with a questioning look. "Excuse me," Thomas murmured, stepping into the aisle. He was tall, 6'2", with broad shoulders, and his presence immediately drew eyes as he moved forward. The whole cabin had gone quiet. Even the baby that had been crying moments before seemed to sense the tension and fell silent. Thomas made his way to where the young woman stood, her hand still on her reddening cheek. The older woman who had slapped her was half standing, her face a mix of anger and something else, maybe the first flicker of understanding that she'd crossed a serious line. "That's enough," Thomas said. His voice wasn't particularly loud, but in the silence of the cabin it carried clearly. He wasn't yelling or threatening, just stating a simple fact. "That's enough." He positioned himself between the two women, creating a human barrier. Up close, he could see the young woman was trembling slightly. The older woman's expensive perfume filled the small space, mixing with the recycled airplane air. "She bumped into me on purpose," the older woman said, her voice higher than before. "She needs to learn some manners." Thomas didn't argue or accuse. He simply turned to the young woman first. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her eyes had filled with tears she was clearly fighting to hold back. "What's your name?" he asked. "Zoe," she whispered. "I'm Thomas," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm a doctor. That must have hurt. Can I take a look at your cheek?" A flight attendant had pushed her way up the aisle by this point, her professional calm slightly cracked by the unusual situation. "Sir, please return to your seat," she started, but Thomas turned to her with the same calm certainty he used in the operating room. "My name is Dr. Thomas Chen. I'm a neurosurgeon at Mercy Hospital," he explained. "This young woman was just assaulted. I believe that constitutes an in-flight emergency, and I'm offering medical assistance." The flight attendant hesitated, then nodded. "I'll get the chief purser," she said, turning to find her supervisor. Thomas turned back to the older woman, who had now sat down again, her earlier confidence deflating under the gaze of dozens of passengers. "Ma'am, hitting another person is assault," he said quietly but firmly. "It doesn't matter where we are, on a plane, in a store, on the street. We don't hit people." He spoke as if explaining something obvious, the way he might tell a child not to touch a hot stove. Not angry, not accusatory, just stating a basic truth everyone should know. The chief purser arrived, a heavy-set man with salt and pepper hair and the weary efficiency of someone who'd seen a lot during his years in the sky. "What happened here?" he asked, looking between the three of them. Before the older woman could speak, voices piped up from around them. "She slapped that girl for no reason. It was completely unprovoked. I got it on video." The purser took in the situation quickly and turned to Thomas. "Thank you for stepping in, doctor. We'll take it from here." The chief purser handled the situation with the efficiency of someone who'd dealt with emergencies before, though perhaps not quite like this one. He quickly arranged for the older woman, who reluctantly identified herself as Helen Reynolds, to be moved to an empty seat at the back of the plane, far away from Zoe. "Is this really necessary?" Helen huffed as a flight attendant escorted her down the aisle. "She was the one who bumped into me." Many passengers watched with disapproving looks as she passed. A middle-aged woman in a blue sweater shook her head. A teenager held up his phone, still recording. Helen lowered her eyes and hurried past. Meanwhile, the purser had brought Zoe a cup of water and an ice pack wrapped in a thin airline napkin. "Hold this against your cheek," Thomas advised, showing her how to apply it gently. "It will help with any swelling." Zoe's hands were still trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't even know what happened. One minute I was just trying to go to the bathroom, and the next—" "None of this was your fault," Thomas assured her. He glanced around at the other passengers, many of whom were nodding in agreement. The purser crouched in the aisle beside them. "Miss, I want to apologize on behalf of the airline. This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable on our flights or anywhere else." He lowered his voice. "I've radioed ahead. Airport police will meet us when we land." "Police?" Zoe looked alarmed. "What she did was assault," Thomas explained gently. "You have the right to press charges if you want to." "I don't know if I want to make a big deal out of this," Zoe started, then trailed off. An older gentleman from across the aisle leaned over. "Young lady, I recorded the whole thing on my phone. If you need a witness or evidence, I'm happy to provide it. Me too, called a woman a few rows back. Same here, added someone else. The purser nodded. We take these incidents very seriously. I'll need statements from witnesses when we land. The remainder of the 3-hour flight passed in a blur for Zoe. Thomas returned to his seat after making sure she was okay, but people kept stopping by to check on her or offer support. A grandmotherly woman handed her a homemade cookie from a bag she brought aboard. My grandson is about your age, she said simply. A businesswoman in a tailored suit passed her a business card. I'm an attorney. Call me if you need advice. No charge. By the time they began their descent, Zoe had collected phone numbers, business cards, and words of encouragement from at least a dozen passengers. When they finally landed and the seatbelt sign turned off, no one rushed to stand as they usually would. Instead, passengers remained seated as the purser made an announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated momentarily. Airport authorities need to board first. 2 police officers and an airline representative entered the plane. They spoke briefly with the purser, who pointed toward the back where Helen sat, now looking considerably less confident than she had hours before. The officers approached Helen first. Zoe couldn't hear what was said, but she saw Helen gesturing emphatically, her face flushed. She's trying to claim she felt threatened by you, whispered the teenager who had been recording. He'd moved up to sit in the empty middle seat beside Zoe during the flight. Nobody's buying it, though. Look. He held up his phone to show Zoe the video he captured. The footage was crystal clear, Zoe politely trying to pass, the turbulence, Helen's angry reaction, and the unprovoked slap that followed. I've already uploaded it, he said. It's getting tons of shares. Zoe's eyes widened. You mean people are seeing this? Like, a lot of people? The teenager nodded. It's going viral. #PlaneSlap is trending. For the first time since the incident, Zoe felt a strange mix of emotions, embarrassment at being the center of attention, but also relief that the truth was so clear for everyone to see. As the story of the plane slap spread across social media and news outlets, people became curious about the individuals involved. Who were these people whose lives had collided at 30,000 feet? Zoe had grown up in a small apartment on the east side of town. Her mom worked 2 jobs, mornings at a daycare center and evenings waiting tables at a local diner. There was never much money, but there was always love and determination in their home. You're going to college, her mom would say, setting aside tips in a jar labeled Zoe's future. You're going to have chances I never had. And Zoe took that seriously. While other kids hung out at the mall on weekends, she studied. When her high school friends went to parties, she often stayed home to finish assignments or prepare for tests. It wasn't that she didn't know how to have fun, she just had her eyes on something bigger. Her hard work paid off when she received a partial scholarship to study computer science at a university 3 states away. Even with the scholarship, she worked part-time at the campus bookstore to help cover costs. The flight she had been on was a rare treat. Her grandmother had sent her the ticket so she could visit during spring break. Thomas, the doctor who had intervened, came from a different world entirely. He'd grown up in a comfortable suburb with parents who emphasized education and service. His father taught history at a local high school, and his mother ran a community health clinic. When Thomas was 10, he'd broken his arm falling from a tree. At the hospital, a kind doctor had explained exactly what was happening as he set the bone. You're not scared at all, the doctor had observed. I like knowing how things work, young Thomas had replied. That curiosity never left him. He studied hard, earned scholarships, and worked his way through medical school. Now, at 42, he was respected in his field but still made time to volunteer at free clinics twice a month. The medical conference he'd been attending when the incident occurred had been about bringing advanced care to underserved communities, something he felt passionate about. When he saw Zoe being slapped, he hadn't thought about becoming involved in a viral story. He'd simply seen someone who needed help. Then there was Helen Reynolds, the woman who had slapped Zoe. Her story was more complicated than many wanted to believe. Helen had grown up in wealth and privilege. Her father owned a chain of car dealerships, and she had never wanted for anything material. But the Reynolds household had strict rules about appearances and behavior. We're not like other people, her mother would remind her. We have standards to maintain. Those standards included ideas about who was worth respecting and who wasn't. Helen had absorbed these attitudes without questioning them. She'd risen through the ranks at a real estate company to become an executive with her own corner office. Her coworkers found her demanding and difficult, but effective at her job. What the viral videos didn't show was that Helen had been under tremendous pressure that week. Her company was downsizing, and for the first time in her career, her position was in jeopardy. She'd been told to prove her value or face early retirement. That morning, she'd received an email suggesting her latest proposal had been rejected. The flight was already delayed. And then, in her stressed state, when the plane hit turbulence and Zoe stumbled against her. None of this excused what she did. But as the backgrounds of all three main characters in this drama came to light, people began to see a more complex picture of human lives intersecting in a moment that would change all of them. By the next morning, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. #PlanerSlap was trending nationwide, and news channels were running the story in heavy rotation. Reporters camped outside Helen's suburban home and tried to track down Zoe and Thomas for interviews. Zoe woke up to hundreds of notification pings on her phone. Her social media accounts had exploded overnight. Most messages were supportive, but the sudden attention felt overwhelming. "Honey, you're on the morning news," her grandmother called from the living room of her small house. Zoe walked in to see her own face on the TV screen as a news anchor discussed the incident, bringing renewed attention to how bystanders should respond when witnessing discrimination. The anchor was saying. Zoe's phone rang. It was a producer from a morning talk show asking if she would share her story on national television. Before she could decide, 3 more calls came in from other shows. Her grandmother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to talk to any of them if you don't want to," she said. "This is your story to tell or keep private." After thinking it over, Zoe decided to do one interview with a thoughtful journalist she respected. She didn't want to become known only as the girl who got slapped on the plane, but she saw an opportunity to talk about something important. During the interview, she shifted the focus away from herself. "What happened to me happens to people every day," she explained. "The difference is that someone stood up to help and others recorded it. That's what made this time different." When asked about pressing charges against Helen, Zoe was thoughtful. "I'm still deciding. I don't want revenge. I want change." Thomas, meanwhile, declined most interview requests. When reporters showed up at his hospital, he simply said, "I did what I hope anyone would do," before returning to his patients. His hospital colleagues weren't surprised by his actions. "That's just who he is," said a nurse who had worked with him for years. "Always the first to help and the last to take credit." But Thomas did agree to speak at a conference on bystander intervention at a local university. There, he talked not about himself, but about the responsibility we all have to one another. "In that moment on the plane, I wasn't thinking about being brave," he told the packed auditorium. "I was thinking about my daughters and what I would want someone to do if they were in trouble." Sometimes standing up is as simple as saying that's enough and being a presence between harm and the person being harmed. Students gave him a standing ovation, and his talk was shared widely online, inspiring conversation about when and how to safely intervene when witnessing injustice. For Helen, the public response was swift and harsh. Her company placed her on indefinite leave after clients threatened to take their business elsewhere. Neighbors avoided eye contact when she collected her mail. Her country club membership was quietly suspended. She retreated inside her large house, blinds drawn, ignoring the reporters outside. Her phone filled with angry messages from strangers and disappointed ones from friends. One evening, about a week after the incident, Helen's doorbell rang. She ignored it at first, assuming it was another reporter. When it rang again persistently, she finally checked the camera to see her sister standing there with a bag of groceries. "You look terrible," her sister said when Helen finally opened the door. "When's the last time you ate something?" They sat in Helen's kitchen as her sister made tea. "Everyone hates me," Helen whispered, looking smaller somehow in her expensive silk robe. "You did a hateful thing," her sister replied, not unkindly. "That doesn't mean you can't change." For the first time since the incident, Helen broke down in tears. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. Her sister pushed a business card across the table. My friend is a counselor who specializes in bias recognition. This could be a beginning. As the public conversation around the incident continued to grow, all three people at its center were starting to realize that a moment that had lasted seconds would leave lasting impacts on each of their lives. 2 weeks after the incident, Zoe received a letter from a law firm representing Helen Reynolds. The carefully worded document offered a settlement, a sum of money in exchange for Zoe dropping any potential charges and signing a non-disclosure agreement. Zoe sat at her grandmother's kitchen table, the letter spread out before her. "They're trying to make this go away," she said, frowning at the legal jargon. "They want me to take the money and stop talking about what happened." Her grandmother wiped her hands on a dish towel and sat down across from her. "What do you want to do, honey?" Zoe thought about it. The money would cover her remaining college expenses, no more working at the bookstore while trying to keep up with classes, but something about it felt wrong. "I think I need to talk to a lawyer," she finally said. She called the attorney who had given her a business card on the plane. The woman agreed to meet with her the next day. "They're offering this because they're scared," the attorney explained, looking over the settlement offer in her downtown office. "The video evidence is clear. If you press charges or file a civil suit, Helen Reynolds will almost certainly lose." "I don't want to ruin her life," Zoe said. "But I don't want to just let this disappear either." Meanwhile, Helen was facing her own legal troubles. The airline had banned her from future flights and was considering its own lawsuit for disrupting the flight and creating a safety hazard. Her company had moved from placing her on leave to officially terminating her employment. "Your behavior violated our code of conduct," the HR director had explained during an uncomfortable Zoom call. "The public reaction has caused significant damage to our brand." Helen's lawyer, an old family friend, didn't sugarcoat her situation. "You're in a difficult position," he told her bluntly. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. My recommendation is to try to settle with the young woman before this goes to court." What neither Zoe nor Helen expected was that Thomas would also become involved in the legal proceedings. The airline had reached out to him, asking if he would provide a formal statement about what he witnessed. Thomas's statement was clear and factual. He described seeing Helen slap Zoe without provocation. But he also included something unexpected. In his professional opinion as a doctor who had treated many patients in distress, he noted that Helen had shown signs of extreme stress and possible psychological crisis at the time of the incident. This didn't excuse her actions, he emphasized, but might be relevant to understanding them. When the case finally came before a judge, the courtroom was tense. Zoe sat with her attorney on one side, Helen and her lawyer on the other. Thomas was present to give his testimony. What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of accepting the plea deal her lawyer had arranged, Helen asked to address the court directly. "I don't want to make excuses for what I did," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I was under tremendous pressure that day, but that doesn't justify hurting someone else." She turned to face Zoe directly. "I am truly sorry for what I did to you. Nothing in your actions deserved my response. I've spent these last weeks in therapy, beginning to understand the biases and prejudices I've carried without examining them." The judge considered all sides, then made his ruling. Helen would pay a fine and do 200 hours of community service. But most significantly, she would participate in a restorative justice program, a series of facilitated conversations with Zoe, if Zoe was willing. The goal, the judge explained, is not just punishment, but healing and education. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. Zoe slipped out a side door, wanting to avoid the media circus. She found Thomas waiting by the elevators. "You did a brave thing in there," he told her. "So did she, actually," Zoe replied thoughtfully. "I think she's finally facing herself." 1 year after the incident, Zoe stood nervously in front of a lecture hall filled with students. Now a sophomore, she had founded a campus group called Stand Up, Speak Out that trained students on how to safely intervene when they witnessed discrimination or harassment. "A year ago, I was just trying to use the bathroom on a plane," she began, earning a light laugh from the audience. "I never expected to become part of a viral video or to be standing here today talking to all of you." The campus group had started small, just Zoe and a few friends meeting in a dorm lounge. But it had grown quickly as students connected with its mission. They had developed role-playing exercises, created videos showing different intervention techniques, and brought in guest speakers to share personal experiences. Today's speaker was someone special. Zoe smiled as she introduced him. Most of you have probably seen the video of what happened to me on that flight. But what you might not know is what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. The person who stood up for me that day is here to share his perspective. Thomas walked onto the stage, looking slightly uncomfortable with the applause that greeted him. He'd kept in touch with Zoe over the past year, becoming something of a mentor to her. When she asked him to speak to her group, he couldn't say no. "I'm a doctor, not a public speaker," he began with a self-deprecating smile. But Zoe is very persuasive. He spoke about that day on the plane, but focused more on what had happened since. How the experience had made him more aware of situations where he could help. How he'd started training other doctors at his hospital about recognizing and addressing discrimination in healthcare settings. "The truth is, standing up in that moment wasn't extraordinary," he explained. "What's extraordinary is what Zoe has built since then, turning a negative experience into something that helps others." After Thomas finished speaking, Zoe returned to the podium. "We have one more speaker today," she said, "someone who brings a different perspective to our conversation about intervention and change." A hush fell over the room as Helen walked onto the stage. She looked different than she had a year ago, less polished, somehow, but more genuine. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some students whispering to each other. Everyone recognized her face. "Thank you for allowing me to be here," Helen began, her voice quiet but steady. "I know I'm probably the last person many of you want to hear from." She didn't make excuses for what she had done. Instead, she talked about the journey she'd been on since that day, the counseling sessions, the community service hours she'd spent working at a neighborhood center, and the restorative justice meetings with Zoe. "Those meetings were the hardest thing I've ever done," Helen admitted. "Sitting across from someone I had hurt and really listening to how my actions affected her. Not defending myself, not explaining, just listening." She explained how the counseling had helped her recognize patterns of thinking she never questioned before. How working alongside people from backgrounds different from her own had changed her perspective. How losing her job and reputation had forced her to rebuild her identity around something other than status and power. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she said, "and I'm not claiming to be perfectly transformed. I still catch myself thinking in old ways sometimes. But I'm committed to the work of changing, not just to restore my image, but because it's the right thing to do." When the formal presentation ended, students came forward with questions. Many were directed at Zoe and Thomas, but several students wanted to hear more from Helen. One young woman asked what Helen would say to people who didn't believe people could really change. "I would have been one of those skeptics a year ago," Helen replied thoughtfully. "I would have said that people just learn to hide their true feelings better. But that's not what real change is. Real change happens when you question things so deeply that you can't go back to seeing the world the way you did before." After the event, the three speakers shared a quiet dinner at a local restaurant. Their conversation flowed easily now, the initial awkwardness of their first restorative justice meeting long past. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Zoe asked, looking between Thomas and Helen. "The three of us working together like this?" Thomas shook his head. "Never. But that's the thing about standing up in difficult moments. You never know how far the ripples will spread." Helen nodded, her eyes growing serious. "My therapist calls it the gift of consequences. Sometimes the worst thing you do creates the opportunity to become someone better than you were before." As they parted ways that evening, each returning to their separate lives, they carried with them the understanding that a brief encounter at 30,000 feet had permanently altered their life trajectories. One moment of hatred, met with courage, had created not just a viral video, but a movement of change that continued to grow beyond them.